Hi everyone, now it's time to talk about Aristotle's virtue ethics. It's the third ethical theory that we're going to talk about this semester, and it really kind of completes the gamut of different ethical theories once we've looked at utilitarianism, Kant's deontology, and now Aristotle's virtue ethics. Those three kind of, it's not that they're like the only ethical theories out there, but once you have an understanding of those three, most other ethical theories tend to kind of have something in common with one of those three, so that there's they kind of show you a spectrum within which other ethical theories can kind of be placed. Now, a note about reading Aristotle before we get into what I have to say about the theory for you. You may find all these readings difficult for different reasons. Mill, a great writer, but it's old-fashioned English, very long sentences. Kant, by most accounts, not really a good writer, and he has some interesting ideas. They're rather complicated. Aristotle, on the other hand, it's very, very old. Obviously, Aristotle's writing nearly more than 1,000 years before the other two, Kant and Mill. And there are some features of Aristotle's writing that you can find kind of off-putting or strange if you're a student beginning to read this kind of stuff. One thing that might kind of put that in perspective is it's believed by many scholars that what we are reading from Aristotle is actually notes from lectures that he gave, rather than something that's intended to be a fully organized kind of presentation. It's a series of lecture notes, something a little bit more complete, obviously, than say like just slides on a PowerPoint or something. Nevertheless, lecture notes. Another thing about Aristotle that's really kind of difficult and off-putting at first is the way that he will tie together various kind of like threads whenever they sort of come up. So he has a tendency to do this thing where he may sort of start from one point and say, well, here's some reasonable kind of assumptions that we might make, and then see where that leads. And then you think that, okay, so that's where that leads and we're done. But then Aristotle, he's not exactly done. Like, he goes back and says, oh, well, what about this other point? And then he starts from this other point, and let's see where that leads. And if it leads to the same place, well, nice. And if not, well, what do we say about like trying to make these two things match up together? And he's constantly doing this. He's kind of grabbing these different threads from different places and saying, well, what about this thread, and what about this idea, and trying to like sort of weave them together. And it's a little bit off-putting if you're not used to it, because it's like he'll suddenly start again almost. It's like he starts from another starts again from another place. And he also has a different sort of approach to these things than either Mill or Kant, in terms of ideas about proving things and ideas about like sort of philosophy versus common sense and how they relate to each other. Kant doesn't seem to have a need to sort of tie his philosophy in with common sense all that much at all, other than the occasional mention of, well, my categorical imperative looks a little bit like the golden rule, you might notice, but it's a little bit different. It's better than that. And then Mill, on the other hand, certainly has like regards for common sense, but it seems like he doesn't really want to rely on it ever. Aristotle will from time to time say, well, this is kind of common sense, everybody knows this, and then he'll bring that in as one of those threads that he likes to tie into all the other things that he's tying together. And you might find that strange, because he'll just randomly sort of bring in, whoa, wait a minute, everybody says that this is true, and so let's try to tie that in. And you don't see that as much with some of these other philosophers. It has something to do maybe with something Aristotle says about standard standards of proof in different domains. That different domains have sort of, you expect different levels of like establishing things and proving things in different domains. Like, so for example, there's scientific proof, and then in like other areas, with regards to like proving something about societal notions or something about ethics, he says at one point that you have to kind of have an understanding of there's different types of proof, different types of argument that are appropriate to different fields of study, different kinds of topics. And so, at least when it comes to ethics, that's one where he's willing to say, if something has been kind of a long established view, and you find places in there where he says, many men and men of old have always said this. It must be something like it must be true. And he's willing to take things like that into consideration and say, well, if there's something that's considered common sense, we ought to at least kind of either incorporate it or else explain away why they must have said that, but doesn't fit into our theory. So that's something that's different about his methodology, and it's something that you might find off-putting as a student in particular, and even some of us who've studied it many times still find it a bit off-putting. Now, I think it's helpful before diving into like specifics about Aristotle's theory to give you a couple of different themes. It seems to me that you can pick out these themes throughout Aristotle where there are several topics that if you know ahead of time he's going to try to tie together these themes, then it's helpful when you try to go through it, because if you're trying to, there can be a forest for the trees kind of effect. If you're trying to go through that Nicomachean ethics, and you're trying to go through it like detail by detail, it's quite difficult, and it can be made easier if you have this kind of background knowledge of a few different ideas that are going to come into it. They're going to be tied together, and so you've got this kind of preview of what's going on. So let me try to give you something like that. And I've picked out three sort of topics or features of Aristotle's ethics that I think it would be helpful to just keep in mind as you're going through the details. Keep in mind that this is like the overall structure of the theory, some general features that it has. So first of all, Aristotle's ethics is actually his whole philosophy. It heavily emphasizes a concept called teleology. Okay, so this is an expensive word for you. You can impress your friends with this one. What is teleology? It comes from the Greek word telos, and telos just means goal or purpose. So teleology is an approach to studying things with regard to their function or purpose. And this is an approach to studying any topic, really, that Aristotle thought every topic would be sort of studied in this way, including even like scientific topics. His approach to scientific questions, often he would ask like, well, what is the purpose or function of this say biological feature? Like he would like a question as simple as why grass grows, and he would consider this just a simple example of finding purposes in things and finding functions in things. He would ask, well, why does grass grow? And the reason must be to feed like animals. And he's just saying, well, they seem to work together like that, so it seems like that's pretty obviously the answer to why grass grows. And he thought that even science would proceed in that way, which probably isn't very accurate as regards to how science has proceeded up to modern times. Although there's still scientists will still talk in terms in these terms sometimes, although they try to sort of eliminate it. You find the Higgs boson particle, and the question is like not just what does it do, but like what is the function of it, right? And isn't that the one that gives gravity to different creates gravity for objects or something like that, so it's kind of hard to avoid talking that way. So maybe it's a little bit understandable that Aristotle thought that that's how all studies would proceed. It doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong about everything if it didn't work that way necessarily throughout the history of science. So when it comes to ethics, you're going to find that Aristotle thinks that the concept of function should be emphasized in studying ethics, and we'll come back to just how that ties in. The next idea that is sort of an ingredient in Aristotle's ethics is what philosophers call natural law theory. Natural law theory can actually mean a couple of different things. Sometimes the idea of natural law, it simply means objectivism about ethics or realism about ethics, that there is such a thing as a correct moral stance. And so this is described as like the natural law as opposed to like human laws, and that's maybe why we think that natural law is a component of Aristotle's theory. But in this case, it means something a little more specific than that. The idea that morality somehow connects up with nature. That the question of whether something's right or wrong is intimately tied up with questions about what's natural. And how nature works. That we or that we look to nature in order to figure out, something being right or wrong. This has been a really influential idea throughout the history of ethical thought. If you look at debates from like Civil War, American Civil War days over slavery, this is one of the things that both sides were arguing about what was natural, right? One side was saying, well, slavery is just the natural way of things, right? That's a phrase that comes up in this regard, the natural way of things. And then the other side was saying, slavery is not natural at all. It's completely unnatural because people are naturally in charge of themselves and so on. Another example would be more recently in debates over things like homosexuality. One type of argument that gets made about it is like whether it's natural or not, right? People will say, well, it's unnatural. So the idea has been really influential that somehow nature is connected up with looking at nature is connected up with figuring out morality, and maybe even the two are one and the same in some sense. So that's natural law theory. Another idea in Aristotle's ethics, and this is something that's going to be kind of tough to get your head around at first. Aristotle's what some philosophers call a virtue ethicist. So this means that he emphasizes the concept of virtue as being central, the central ethical concept. Now, what does that mean? Maybe that sounds like an old-fashioned word, virtue, right? Virtues are just good character traits, and they're to be contrasted with vices, negative character traits. Maybe you've heard the word vices being used, like, and some people talk about vices like, oh, smoking is that's my vice, I smoke. That's not really what it means in the context of ethics. A vice is like an ethically bad trait that you have. Like it would be a tendency to do something that's maybe harmful to other people or negative in a more serious way than just like, oh, I smoke or something, like there is like a traditional Christian idea of emphasizing vices, and you've heard of the 7 deadly sins, and these would be considered vices, like, greed is a vice, being greedy or being wrathful is another example of a vice. And so virtues are to be contrasted with vices, and virtues are like generally recognized positive character traits, that is morally positive. And there are virtues that are considered sort of like, traditional, like they're on the list of virtues, like you may have heard honesty is a virtue, or patience is a virtue is a popular saying. In Aristotle's time, it was kind of accepted that there were 4 main virtues. This is an ancient Greek idea, that courage, wisdom, temperance, and justice, that those were like, those are the 4 big ones. So now Aristotle's thinking in terms of virtues being the main concept that you want to study. You know, what are these positive character traits versus the negative ones? And it goes even a little bit deeper than that, because you could study the virtues, you could be interested in, you know, character traits, but there's a question of definition. How are moral concepts defined? Which definition is sort of the definition from which the others are taken? So all of that might sound like a very kind of abstract, vague description of it. Let me try and be a little more specific here and say that Aristotle's theory is different in this way from both Mill and Kant. So Mill and Kant provide theories of ethics that we might call rule theoretic, right? Obviously Kant is very based on rules, like what is good action, what sort of action is right to do, and you know, the kind of intention that you have to do that action. And that was contrasted with utilitarianism because it doesn't define it in terms of consequences, but it does have this in common with utilitarianism, that the utilitarians also focus on a question of what's to be done, right? First we can define what it is to do the right thing. And then once we have that definition, you're a good person if you do the right thing. Or maybe it's a list of things that here are the right things to do. If you want to be a good person, right, you do this, you do that, you do the other thing. The Aristotelian idea, the idea behind virtue ethics, is instead of first defining what it is to do the right thing, and then you're a good person if you do the things on the list, the idea is that being good, being a good person, is a more central concept than doing the right thing. So that first we think about what it means to be a good person, and we can define that without so much concern for you know, coming up with a list of things that are right to do. And once we have that definition, if you want to know what the right thing is to do, well, it's the thing that a virtuous person would do. You can think of this in terms of like an order of priorities, like in terms of figuring out things. Like first, with rule-based ethics, the idea is you have this rule that tells you to do the right thing, and then if you do the right thing, that makes you, right, a good person. Right? So what is a good person? If you ask what is a good person, the answer is like someone who does the right thing. So there's sort of first we understand this. First we understand doing the right thing, and then we can understand being a good person, like derivatively. The idea with virtue ethics is that it's the other way around. First we define the idea of a good person, and then, you know, good things to do are, well, whatever things good people do, right? So that the idea of being a good person is defined first, then afterwards the concept of doing the right thing is derivative from that. Now, that may turn out to be a purely philosophical difference, right? I mean, it could, like, so it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of like looking at what's going on in the world and saying, okay, well, that person's doing this, so that makes them a good person, you know, versus saying, you know, like a Goku's a good person and he's doing this, so of course, like, you know, that's a good thing to do. It may turn out that you're looking at the same results anyway, but it might not. I mean, you can imagine how thinking about a person being good primary to things to do, you might get a different sort of outcome. You might get a different thought about things being right or wrong. Like, what if, for example, a good person doesn't always behave in exactly the same way in all the same circumstances? You know, what if it sort of depends? I mean, so there's potential for different actual resulting statements about what you think is good and what you think is bad if you were coming from these different theories. Of course, or maybe not. It's debatable. Maybe it's just a purely philosophical difference. So in any case, Aristotle is falls into the camp of a virtue ethics. So that's at least theoretically different from Mill and Kant, because who come up with these rules. So there's three kind of aspects of the theory, and then another kind of preview thing that I'd like to give you is there are a number of different ideas that Aristotle wants to kind of tie together, concepts that he thinks are connected with ethics. And he's in crafting his whole theory, he seems to have this in mind, and it can help you make sense of the whole thing if you know about this ahead of time rather than trying to just go through detail by detail. So I'm going to pick four that I think seem to be central in Aristotle's ethics. There may be some others you could tie in there too, but certainly these four ideas Aristotle thinks are like deeply connected, and he's kind of exploring how they're connected. And like I said about it being kind of off-putting when you're reading it, because he's just pulling in these different threads seemingly from all over the place and saying, well, what about how does this tie in? How does this tie in? If you know ahead of time, it kind of helps it. It kind of helps it make sense. So there's at least these four things. Happiness is one. Virtue is another one. Purpose, or maybe function, would be an even more kind of concrete word for it. And fourth, rationality. All these ideas are connected in Aristotle's view, and he's sort of exploring the details of those connections. It's almost as if it's a background assumption that they've got to be connected somehow. And now that I've given you kind of a general overview, different themes that tie together for Aristotle, let's try to take a look at some of the specifics as he goes through them. And one thing that might sort of throw you off about Aristotle is, as you're going through it, there's this sort of, he gives you this process of exploration in a way, of the idea. He doesn't just like come out with it like Kant does, like, okay, here's the categorical compare. Aristotle doesn't say like, okay, here's my theory. It's like he starts off with some kind of initial brooding on, all things good, right? So the book has a famous beginning. Every art and every inquiry has as its aim some good. So he's thinking in terms of this like sort of this world of goods out there that are being pursued and produced, and he concludes that there's a kind of hierarchy among those goods, and what he bases that on is some goods are serving for another good. A modern sort of terminology that some people have put on this is that you can make a distinction between an instrumental good, and Aristotle, the translation we read at least, uses the term instrument, versus what you might call an intrinsic good. So most of the goods that we are familiar with are probably instrumental good. So an instrumental good is something that is good for the sake of something else. You want it so that you can use it to get something else. So the perfect example of an instrumental good is money, right? Money is useful not for what it is itself, just it's meaningless pieces of paper. But what it's useful for is you can use it to buy things, right? It's sort of, we have defined it into existence as an instrumental good. There are other things that are just sort of naturally instrumental goods. Like for example, a pen. Having a pen it's not just like, I want a pen. Why do you want a pen? Just because I want one, right? I mean, it's you wouldn't want it if it wasn't for its ability to write. Like, it's only good insofar as you use it to get something else. Now, some things could be both. Aristotle says health is an example of something that maybe it's an instrumental good. You use it to get something else, but it's also an intrinsic good. Now, an intrinsic good is something that you want it whether it gets you something else or not. It doesn't matter if it gets you anything else. And Aristotle has kind of a ranking of intrinsic goods versus instrumental goods. He thinks something that's an intrinsic good ranks higher whatever higher means, than an instrumental good that gets you to that intrinsic good. So, like for example, gym membership is something that seems it's purely instrumental, right? There's no intrinsic value in a gym membership, right? You wouldn't, if you're not going to do anything with it, you wouldn't want it at all. And what do you want it for? Well, because because you can go there and work out, and it gets you towards health. At least it gives you the chance to, right? You might not do it, but so then Aristotle's thinking is like the thing you really want is the health, right? So it's higher on a sort of scale of what we actually want at the end of the day. What we want is health. We only want the gym membership because it gets us health. If it didn't help you get healthy, then there would be no point in having one, right? Which is why some of us just don't bother having one, because if you're not going to actually go and do it, right? And so Aristotle seems to have this ranking where, like, if the point of X is to get you Y, right? Then Y is sort of the thing you really want, and so it's higher on the scale of things. In Aristotle's sense, like a fishing pole would be an instrumental good. It seems like it's you don't just want a fishing pole just because, right? You want a fishing pole because it gets you fish. Now, fish is also not something that you want like just for the sake of having it, right? So some instrumental goods are valuable because they lead to other instrumental goods. For example, a fishing pole in order to get fish. And so he would say like the higher goal is the fish. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about, because there's the old saying, right? Give a man a fish. What is it? Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Give a man a fishing pole and he'll eat for a lifetime. Well, that's not exactly it. It's like more like teach a man to fish. But never mind that. If you give someone a fishing pole, that saying seems to suggest it's better than giving them a fish. And that might seem at first like it kind of conflicts with what Aristotle's saying, right? Like you want a fishing pole is better to have than like one fish. But this other sense of things is what Aristotle has in mind. Not which one is like better to have, but which one is the thing you really want, right? Because you'd rather have a fishing pole than like one fish, but you wouldn't rather have a fishing pole than a lifetime supply of fish. If you had a lifetime supply of fish, you wouldn't bother with a fishing pole. Well, there's recreation too, right? That's another thing that you would want the fishing pole for recreation, right? Aside from just the fact that you actually get fish with it. But in any case, it seems like we can reconcile these two ways of looking at hierarchy of value, right? On the one sense, Aristotle's ranking things. He's interested in what is the thing that you ultimately want. And it might be that sometimes a small amount of that is not preferable to having a longer lasting supply of whatever it is, the thing that gets you to what you want, right? But then at the end of the day, what you really want is the end product. So it's higher in equal supply, right? It's better to have that if it were equal supply. Yeah, maybe I'm not completely reconciling those two ideas, but it seems like maybe it could be done. It'd be, there's an interesting project to think about. In any case, Aristotle soon comes to this conclusion that you have all these instrumental goods out there, these things that are useful for getting other things. It forms kind of like a giant sort of tree structure, right? Where, if you want a fishing pole in order to get fish, and then you want it for recreation, and then what do you want recreation for? Well, because it's fun. And what do you want fish for eating and so on? And there are other goals that all kinds of goals. We won't try to name everything, but there would be this sort of, if you map them all out, there would be this sort of massive tree diagram with one thing leading to another thing, maybe leading to multiple things, and maybe multiple things leading to the same thing. And we can ask, the interesting question for Aristotle is there something that's at the very top of this sort of hierarchy, where there's something that's everything is ultimately about getting this thing? And he thinks immediately after putting the idea out there, once you think about this sort of hierarchy of goals and goods, the answer is pretty obvious. He says pretty much everyone agrees. Happiness, that's what all these things end up heading towards. And Aristotle sort of further reinforces the idea that this makes sense, that happiness is what everything's aiming towards, because first of all, isn't it an intrinsic good? We want happiness just because we want it. In fact, unlike other things that are intrinsically good, it's only intrinsically good, Aristotle points out. It doesn't make sense. If you ask, what do you want a fishing pole for? Well, I want to go fishing. Why do you want to go fishing? Well, I want to catch fish. Why do you want that? Well, I want to eat them. Well, also it's fun. And if you just it's like if you continued asking this sort of why question, like, it's like this stereotypical like 5-year-old kid asks, so why do you want, well, why are you going to do that? Why are you going to do that? And eventually you get to eventually you get, well, I want those things because then that's going to make me happy. And at that point, Aristotle's idea is, if someone asked why do you want that? Why do you want to be happy? At this point, the question doesn't really make sense. It's like, I just do. That's because it's ultimate. That's the end of this sort of chain of why questions. It ends with, I want to be happy. Not only that, like, it wouldn't even make sense to ask what you were going to do with it once you got happiness, right? Imagine someone saying, okay, it makes sense all the way down, like, you want a fishing pole, why? Oh, well, okay, I'll tell you why, there's a reason. You want fish, why? I'll tell you there's a reason, because I want to eat, and then so on. But when you get to happiness and someone says, oh, happiness? What are you going to do with that once you get it? Once you get happiness, what are you going to use happiness to get after that? And that doesn't even make any sense. So happiness is not only something that is intrinsically valuable, it's something that is desired, as Aristotle puts it, only for its own sake. Whereas some of the other things that are intrinsically good, like health is something that you want for its own sake, but you also want it for the sake of other things. There is an answer to the question. If someone says, what do you want to be healthy for? Well, you'd say, so I can do well in my job, or so I can raise my kids well, or there's all kinds of things I want to be able to do that I need to be healthy and able to do them. So health is, although it's intrinsically valuable, it's not strictly intrinsically valuable. It's valuable in both senses. It's an instrumental good as well as an intrinsic good. But happiness is only an intrinsic good. And this has a sense of finality for Aristotle. He thinks that that's a sign that it's really at the top of this scale in a way that even health is not. So he seems to describe, it seems like we could redescribe what he's saying, that happiness is, if not the only, then at least the main intrinsic goal. He never commits to saying that's the only one, but he does seem to say it's the chief one. It's the main intrinsic goal. He points out some other things about it. One is it's translated as being self-sufficient. Not exactly. It's not super clear what he means there by saying it's self-sufficient. Seemingly, once you get happiness, you're at the end of the line. Not that you wouldn't want anything else, but I think the idea is just that you've achieved kind of the final goal once you've got it. The idea, it seems to be that it's not. It's not useful for getting something else. It's self-sufficient in the sense that, like, once you have happiness, you don't use it to get something else, and that it's its own end. Is his way of putting it. And another phrase he uses that's maybe a little puzzling is he says that it's properly belonging to its possessor. The idea maybe here is that other things, once you get them, it's only temporary that you have them, and they're still sort of external to you. Like, you want to you buy a fishing pole so that you can go fishing, and then you catch a fish. It's like, now you got this fish, but that's not it's not as much like internal to you. It's not as much a part of you as maybe as happiness, which is the ultimate goal here. He has another conclusion that's kind of interesting. It seems like almost a side conclusion. So once he's thought about this nature of happiness as sort of the ultimate goal, and it's like at the top of this scale, it also suggests another conclusion to him about political science, interestingly, which he just sort of points out, and then he kind of moves on. Presumably to tie that in as like another one of these threads that he's going to pick up in this case much later on. That political science is sort of must have as its goal happiness. And the idea is that there's also a kind of a similar hierarchy. It's like a parallel hierarchy dealing with sort of arts and projects, right? So he at one point he gives an example about like, horsemanship, being skilled at riding horses, and this has a subservient relationship to like generalship in this, well, at least in terms of in the military it does. You have your horsemen in the military, and the reason why they practice the skill of horsemanship is so that the general can tell them what to do and they can win the war, right? So there's this relationship between being a good general. If the general is good, he can tell the horsemen what to do, and then the horsemen are good horsemen, so they go off and execute his orders well, and then that ends up winning the war, and so on and so on. So that there's also like another parallel hierarchy where you have a similar sort of pyramid of kind of like activities that are in service of each other. And political science would be the science of how to govern well, how to run the whole system. So that's obviously going to be at the top of the scale of these arts and crafts and studies, right? So if that's at the top of the scale of those, its objective must be the good that's at the top of the scale of goods. So there's this relationship between political science and happiness, kind of just an interesting almost side conclusion in a way, but I'm sure it ties into the whole system. It's not always easy to tie everything together with Aristotle, though. So in any case, we've made this initial kind of point about goods being stacked in a kind of pyramid, and where happiness is at the top of the pyramid. It's the thing that everything is supposed to be about, and then political science, corresponding study that's at the top of its pyramid. But he says it wouldn't be enough to just come to this conclusion that happiness is what everything's about. Well, that's we've maybe given a little more detail on that idea, but he says it would have been a platitude anyway. So we've got to go into a little more detail than this. We've got to get a better understanding of it than this. And here, what better way than to consider the function of a person? And here you might be kind of put off by, it seems kind of like a sudden change of subject almost, but you have to keep in mind this background idea that he's got these themes that he wants to tie together. And so, considering what the function of a person is, well, it sort of makes sense that would kind of tie into someone's happiness tie into what happiness means. If you've got this background notion of having a person having a function. Now, if we think about the concept of function or purpose in general, before getting into Aristotle, how he ties this into the function of a person, we can focus first on like sort of manufactured items, like a knife or an eraser. We know the purpose of a knife, and we know the purpose of an eraser. How do we know it? Well, we know that people designed it for that purpose. I mean, we know that that's what erasers were made for erasing, right? That's what knives were made for cutting. On the other hand, suppose you'd never seen one before. Suppose you walked into a classroom with a chalkboard at the front of it, and you've never ever seen an eraser before because you're from some remote tribe where they have no technology and so on, right? So you walk into this classroom. You think you could figure out what the eraser at the front of the classroom was for? Now it might be puzzling at first, but I feel like eventually you'd figure out. I mean, you'd figure out what the chalk was for. How would you figure this out? Um, Well, you might take the chalk and kind of drag it across the board and notice that it makes a mark. So it's useful for making marks. Like it does do that. It's effective for making marks. Of course, it's effective for like other things too. Like you could try to use it to like hold up the window. You could put the piece of chalk between the window and the windowsill, right? It might not work the best for that, so it doesn't work particularly well for other things. It does work for making marks on the chalkboard, and then other things could mark on the chalkboard too, but maybe not so well. So it's got a kind of uniqueness to it. It's like nothing does it quite so well as the piece of chalk, and then you might think about the placement of it as well, the fact that it's right up there next to the chalkboard. So you figure out that the chalk is for writing on the board, and you figure out the eraser wipes that off too. And you could figure out the function of these things. Now, what's interesting about this, and what's kind of maybe a little foreign about this, a little strange to think about, is that Aristotle assigns purposes not only to manufactured items, but he thinks that things in the natural world have functions as well. Take the example of a thorn on a rose, right? I mean, you have this like plant, cheapo drawing of a rose here, and it's got these thorns all up the stalk. Again, like the person examining the chalk and the eraser, you imagine you're examining this thing that you've never seen before, and ouch, right? You notice that those things are sharp, and they poke you, right? Draw blood. Aristotle thinks it becomes pretty obvious what they're for, doesn't it? I mean, the reason why this plant has those thorns on it is because otherwise animals would be eating it, but it doesn't want to get eaten, so it has these thorns that are warding off the animals. And you could think this way about all kinds of things in nature. Why does on the other hand, why does the animal have teeth? The teeth are serving a function. And even something like the rain, Aristotle says you can ask a question, well, what's the purpose of it? What's the function of it? It does seem to serve the purpose of like feeding the grass and plants, although it does seem a little strange to say that the rain is there for the purpose of feeding the crops. But on the other hand, it sort of makes sense in a way, right? The natural world for Aristotle is a teleological world. I brought this up earlier just to explain the term, really. But there are purposes of things according to Aristotle. But things in nature have purposes according to Aristotle. He's going to connect up this idea of something having a purpose with evaluating that thing. And isn't it naturally connected with evaluating something that you talk about the purpose that it has? I mean, if you've got an eraser or a knife, and you want to say, is this a good eraser? Is this a good knife? The main thing that matters is whether it does what a knife is supposed to do, or does what an eraser is supposed to do. And couldn't you say the same thing about the thorns on a rose? A rose could have thorns that are very good in terms of serving their purpose. They're really sharp. Another rose could be kind of wilted, and the thorns are not very sharp. They're kind of they get kind of rubbery and they're not as resistant, and so it's in poor shape, you might say, right? So you're evaluating things, and when you evaluate something, you're always thinking in terms of how well it serves its function, and this ends up being a kind of a central idea in Aristotle's his ethics and his whole concept of evaluation. Really, evaluating something is always tied up with its function and whether it serves that function well. In fact, you could say that he's got a teleological thesis running through the whole system of ethics, and it's this kind of pattern, you could say, of virtuous or good. We might use the word good. It's a different word. It's a different word for Aristotle than his word for good, but we would use the word good as well. But a virtuous X, right, is one that serves the purpose of an X well. So if you want to know if something's a good version of what it is, the first thing you have to know is what's the point of that kind of thing. And then you see if this one does that thing well. And maybe it's a good idea to point out in this case that the word here that Aristotle is using, it's translated as virtue, is arete. And we're told by experts in ancient Greek that a more kind of precise translation would be the specific excellence of something. So again, it's more closely tied to the idea of what it's supposed to do, what it's particularly good for. And so Aristotle's going to tie this general thesis that always evaluating something is a question about its purpose to human beings, to people. If we know what the purpose of a human being is, then we'll be able to evaluate one as a virtuous or not a virtuous human being. In other words, a good person or not such a good person, right? So there's a connection here, and there's one that we don't necessarily always make between two ways of using the word, well, the way we use the word good, and it seemed to connect up with Aristotle's use of the term virtue. Like, we talk about a person being a good person, like morally, he or she is a good person. And then a sense of someone being good at something, like they're a good basketball player or something, right? And replacing good with virtuous, Aristotle seems to have the idea that the meaning is kind of the same. That when you talk about something being, say, an excellent knife, and you talk about a person being an excellent person, right? That those meanings are connected. Like, an excellent knife is one that does what a knife's supposed to do, right? It cuts well. And then an excellent person does what a person's supposed to do. Now, this might seem kind of strange to the modern ear, but in fact, Aristotle says it seems strange to him that there wouldn't be a function of a person, right? Wouldn't it be? He says, wouldn't it be weird if, like, a lyre player had a purpose, and a flute player had a purpose, and an athlete had a purpose, but a human being doesn't have a purpose? Like, a person should have a purpose, just like any of these specific categories of people have a purpose. And so then we have to consider, well, what is the purpose of a person? And the way Aristotle goes about this is it's kind of like a process of elimination. He just kind of cycles through some plausible suggestions. Well, here's something that might be, here's something else that might not, or here's something that might be. But then he just eliminates some of those choices. So one of the things we do in life is we nourish ourselves, we nourish and grow, right? I mean, that's a major activity in life. Maybe that's our purpose. But Aristotle says no, because it doesn't have uniqueness, right? It's not something that is unique. It's not something special about humans, right? Plants even do that. What about sensation? That's another big part of life. We go around looking at things, seeing, tasting, touching, right? Maybe that's like the purpose of our life. And here again, he rules it out on the uniqueness issue. He says, well, animals do that too, right? So that can't be our purpose because it's not unique to us. It's not something that we're especially good at, right? And then what about... And it seems like this almost comes out of nowhere. This is kind of a stacked deck. Anyway, he says now he introduces the ringer. What about a sort of rational activity of the soul? That's something we also do. We think about stuff. It is fair to, that is another major human activity, right? And he says, that's got to be it, because that's something that's particular to us. we're particularly good at it, and it's unique, right? So we're good at thinking about stuff, and it's kind of we're the main ones that do it. I guess nowadays we know that there are other animals that do some thinking, but certainly not on a level with what humans do. So, I mean, we've arrived at the answer, says Aristotle. That's what it is. The purpose of a person is this sort of rational activity of the soul. And you might think that he's like saying, rational activity. Okay, so just like thinking about things all the time, like basically being a philosopher. So that's the purpose of humans, is to be philosophers. So we're all supposed to be philosophers, or else we're something like less than that, right? And it's not actually. He doesn't say that. We have to look later when he sort of refines this idea, because he thinks that we're all rational in our own sort of different ways, and he ties this rationality into more everyday kind of activities. So it's not so much, he's not actually claiming that we have to all go around being philosophers. This is just kind of a preliminary conclusion that it's something to do with rationality. So don't jump to the conclusion, he's saying everybody's got to be a philosopher. So up to this point in the discussion, Aristotle has established this kind of alignment between several evaluative terms. So good and virtue and function. So he has sorted out to some extent the relationship between those. And next is to move on to happiness, which he brought up happiness in the beginning. He said that was the ultimate goal. So now he sort of asks, well, what's the relationship between virtue and happiness? In other words, would a person who was virtuous, do you get happiness from that? He makes an argument that virtue is generally kind of related to happiness. He doesn't make the connection as strong as his teacher Plato had. Just to put things in context as far as why would he say some of the things about it that he's saying, Plato, who as you know was the teacher of Aristotle, Plato tried to argue that virtue would bring happiness no matter what, and even in the worst of circumstances. And Aristotle kind of repudiates that view somewhat. He doesn't go so far with it, but he does make this case that that virtue is going to be conducive to happiness. And there are a couple of points about it that I think he makes. The first argument that he makes is rather tough to interpret. I used to think the key element in it was this sort of excellent person, that it was an argument about, well, the excellent person is going to be happy because they're excellent, among other things. But rereading it this time, I find there's a slightly different point being made. He makes this point about, I guess it might be valuing values. That's one way I'm taking it, at least right now. Well, he makes, in the translation we read, he makes the argument, a virtuous person values things that are naturally valuable, whereas if you value anything else, would be to value something that isn't really inherently valuable. Like he gives the example of a horse, right? If someone's into horses and they value this great horse, they're valuing something that isn't inherently, it's not inherent in its nature that it's valuable. But if a person is virtuous, then they're valuing, like values themselves, maybe is the idea? Or does he just mean that like a horse isn't really as good as virtues, as good behavior, good character traits, and so on? It's a little puzzling. It's difficult to sort out. I'm thinking the idea is that the virtuous person values, right, which are inherently valuable. You can also value something like a horse, and because you like to watch horses race or something, and that's fine. But if you're valuing values themselves, well, then what you're valuing is itself a value, and so there's something maybe more rational about that. It makes more sense. On the other hand, it's not exactly clear how that is supposed to relate to happiness, though. Another point he makes that's like more closely connected with happiness, I call it the required happiness argument. And the required happiness argument is an interesting one. It's kind of it seems a little sneaky, like I mentioned with the competent judges argument that Mill gives about intellectual pleasures. There's something suspicious about it. There's something that seems kind of sneaky about it. If someone isn't happy about being virtuous, then they're not completely virtuous, right? So it's, it's part of being good that you like being good, right? I mean, you're not quite there yet. If you do the right thing, but you're not happy, but you're really like, I guess I got to do this, then you're not a completely good person. Like that's not quite ideal. So now the argument is, since that's a requirement, that's a necessary condition of being fully good, is to be happy about it. Therefore, a good person will be happy. Which is kind of, there's something sneaky about that, right? You're saying, well, of course you'll be happy if you're a good person, if you're virtuous, you'll be happy. You have to be happy. You're required to, in order to call you good. So then, being good makes you happy. Well, there's a little bit of a mix-up there. See, it being a requirement that you be happy, it doesn't establish that being good makes you happy, like that it's the thing that makes you happy, right? Instead, he's saying, well, you're required to be happy in order to be good. So virtuous people will be happy, but not because being virtuous is making them happy. So it's a very clever kind of point, but there is this problem with it. Now, he sort of qualifies the statement that, okay, the virtuous person is going to tend to be happy in several ways. So the one thing that he brings up is, suppose that a person is a virtuous person and they have a tendency to be happy, but they just encounter horrible luck in their life, and everybody around them, all their friends die or something, or there just seems to be like just rocks just hailing down from the sky on this person's house, and everything just goes poorly for them. And Aristotle says you're not going to be happy in that situation, regardless of how virtuous you are, or how much of a tendency towards happiness you have. It's just, and this is in contrast to, again, his teacher Plato, who said, the virtue will bring you happiness no matter what else happens in your life. And Aristotle's saying, no, that's going way too far. I mean, if you have all these misfortunes heaped upon you, you're not going to be happy no matter how good you are and how much of a tendency towards happiness you have. Another point, another qualification on this issue of virtue making you happy, it seems, is a quote that he brings up from Solon. Solon, a famous ancient Greek poet that everyone sort of regards his statements as wise. And this is one of the things I mentioned that Aristotle will do. Well, he'll take an old saying, like I took the saying about give a man a fish. Well, Aristotle will look at sayings like that, and he'll try to work them in, incorporate them. And he does this with this Solon quote: "The count no man happy until he's dead," which is like a bit of a paradoxical statement, right? I mean, you're going to call someone happy when they're dead. And the way Aristotle takes it is that you look at the person's whole life, right, to consider whether they were a happy person or not. He's talking about happiness in terms of across your whole life, not like being giddy at a particular moment, and then you might be really sad in the next moment. But when you look at the life as a whole, that's where you can evaluate whether a person generally was happy or not. So you can't really say, say this person's they're 22 years old and things are going particularly well for them right now, and you'd say they're happy, but you can't really assess the whole life yet, because then they could have a really hard time for the next 50 years or something, and then you'd have to say at the end if they didn't have a overall happy life. So it's this point about assessing the whole life, right? And there you may have these sort of peaks, right, and valleys throughout the person's life, and you sort of assess the whole life as being happy or not. So that's how he interprets this famous quote from Solon. So then, after talking about the relationship between virtue and happiness, and between human function and rationality, and making this claim that virtue tends towards happiness, you find that Aristotle then says, well, let us now examine the nature of virtue, since we've established that that's connected up with happiness. And it's a little bit puzzling, because you already had this discussion on virtue in relationship to function, and that so that a virtuous human will be a human who performs the human function well, which is sort of rationality. And so it seems like you would think, well, didn't we already analyze virtue? And this is one of the things that's kind of it's off-putting about reading Aristotle, because he does tend to like start over and say, well, what if we take a look at this again and think about what the nature of it is, which is what he does with virtue. And he said again, it's like he's going to tie these different threads together, but it's a bit off-putting when you first read it. So the first thing he does in his he's starting a new kind of analysis of virtue, and the first thing he does is distinguish two different kinds of virtue. He seems to think there's a pretty clear distinction between what you call virtues of character, and virtues of character can also be translated as like moral virtues. And then there's virtues of thought, which sometimes gets translated as intellectual virtues. And he thinks that they're very different in the way they sort of function, and especially in the way that they are engendered in us. A virtue of thought, or an intellectual virtue, Aristotle says comes from teaching. Whereas a virtue of character, he says, doesn't come from teaching. Instead, it's developed through habit. It's a little bit puzzling to try and figure out exactly what he's talking about here. I mean, it does make some sense that, virtues of thought, like understanding things, how to think clearly, these are things that come from teaching. And certainly if we want to talk about like knowledge, just knowing things, right, where a teacher tells you these things and now you have this knowledge, well, so that comes from teaching. But according to Aristotle, because virtues of character, moral virtues, involve doing, it's not so much like knowing stuff or even really figuring stuff out. It's a kind of action. So he says it doesn't come from teaching, and what I guess he has in mind by saying it comes from habit is that it's sort of forced on you. Like when you're a kid, your parents like maybe make you behave in a virtuous way. I don't know, they make you share or whatever. They make little 4-year-old Johnny doesn't want to share his toys with Bobby, but you say you have to share, and he doesn't want to, and eventually it gets it gets ingrained in him that like it's good to do this, it's good to share, and so then he is raised right, and he becomes a good person, right? And I think the way we often talk, we would just call that teaching, right? Which is why this is a little bit puzzling the way Aristotle says this. Like, well, that's teaching Johnny to share, right? But it is different than like say something you learn in a classroom, right? Where it's like you get this knowledge, or you get this way of thinking from the teacher, like instructing you to here are some facts, learn these facts, or here are some ways of thinking, apply this to certain cases, versus like just being forced to like do this activity of maybe sharing, say, or whatever. You're forced to do it until it's like imprinted on you that, okay, this is what I do and this is the right thing to do. So we might call it teaching, but for Aristotle it's not really the same kind of teaching in a way. So that's like an initial point on analyzing the concept of virtue. It's just, well, you can distinguish these two kinds. And then it seems that in what follows, Aristotle is sort of focusing on moral virtues or virtues of character, and leaving the issue of virtues of thought, intellectual virtues, to like a later discussion. Another question that he wants to resolve is what kind of thing virtue is. And what he has in mind, he specifies, is it a feeling, maybe it's a feeling, or maybe it's a capacity, or maybe it's a state. So this is another argument, and this is similar to the argument he made like about the nature of virtue in terms of what the things we do. There was that argument about, is it a nourishment and growth, is it sensation, or is it a rational activity? He concludes it's rational activity, and it seems these two discussions are meant to sort of cross-cut each other, so that he's arrived at this conclusion that it's about rational activity, but at the same time it can also fit into one of these categories of a feeling, capacity, or state. So it's again it's something, it's a little off-putting, because you think, oh, I thought you said it was rational activity, now what are you talking about with feeling, capacity, or state? It's again the thread idea. It's like, well, what about analyzing in terms of which one of these things it is, and then combining that with what I said before. And he also uses kind of a process of elimination type argument on this issue as well. He says it's not a feeling. You don't blame people for having their, you have the feelings that you have, and it's not praiseworthy or blameworthy to have this feeling or that feeling. And then so it's not that. Which is interesting, because actually something Aristotle says later it's going to seem like it's in conflict with that. It's a little bit difficult to work out. But in any case, he rules out feeling, right? And then it's also not capacities, he says. A capacity to do something isn't virtuous. It's just the ability to do something, right? So you have to actually do it, right? So if someone just has the ability to be good, it's not that doesn't make them good. So it's not capacity either. And so, of course, it must be a state. And I think this point about virtue being a state as opposed to one of these other things is an interesting component of the whole virtue ethics idea that I described earlier, right? That it's not a way of doing necessarily, it's a way of being, right? So that it's important that the actions flow from a person's character, right? It's just a state of being. It's the way the person is, as opposed to like, here's a list of things you're supposed to do, and then the person just does those things. So you've got to have this internal state that corresponds to it. And one of the things he says about it later on is that it has to be stable and so on. So it can't just be that, oh, you're forcing yourself to do the right thing today. It has to be like that you have this internal state which causes you to do the right thing almost every time or all the time. So the next question that naturally sort of occurs, what kind of state is it? And this is where we get the most kind of famous and central component of Aristotle's ethics, the doctrine of the mean. And he kind of builds up to this idea of the doctrine of the mean by means of a general discussion of moderation. And even from before Aristotle, it's an ancient Greek idea that moderation is a good thing, right? You've probably heard the expression like everything in moderation, which comes from the ancient Greeks. And Aristotle is going to work off of that notion, and he gives examples of like exercise and food. If you want to be healthy, you should exercise, but you have to exercise the right amount, right? There is a point in which a certain amount of exercise can be harmful. And if it's and exercising it under the wrong sort of conditions or circumstances, right? If you're sick, you don't necessarily want to go for a jog or something. You broke your leg, go for a jog. That'll fix it. No, it won't, right? And the same thing with food, of course, right? If you eat too little, right, you're going to be unhealthy. You eat too much, you're going to be unhealthy. And this is different depending on your circumstances. If you're an athlete, that's going to be more, right? So he builds up to this idea that it seems like in every sort of activity, there's some amount of doing things which is the right amount, and it's in a range that's between two extremes. And so he concludes that this is the nature of virtue. And we get this sort of famous statement of what's called the doctrine of the mean, sort of retroactively. Aristotle, he didn't call it that, but it's, virtue is a state that decides. So it's internal, a state, but it's what the state does is it makes decisions, right? And this state consists in a mean. So it's the state that consists in a mean. So that refers to the way the person is. It's some character trait which is like a mean. It consists in a mean. Now the word mean can mean average. He specifically says it's not the same thing as taking an average, but it's some kind of appropriate amount that's in between two extremes. And he says the mean is relative to us. So it apparently depends on your circumstances. just like with the athlete, is going to eat more than the regular person. And defined by reference to reason. So he's working in that connection too, that it's defined in reference to reason. And he mentions this point about, well, it's reason as a practical person would determine it. So there's a rational amount of something. And it will sort of come back to the person of practical reason. And it's a mean between two vices, he says. So the idea seems to be, for every virtue, and Aristotle would just take there are things that are standardly considered virtues, and Aristotle's he's not producing like some new list of the virtues. There are things everybody knows are virtues. To give an example, courage, right? Everybody knows courage is a good character trait, and so Aristotle says courage is having the right amount of something in your character. It's like on a scale where there's too much of something, or there's too little of something, and then there's just the right amount of that thing. And in the case of each virtue, you can figure out like what is the thing that you can have too much of or too little of. Courage is an example that works really nicely in this system because, right, clearly it has something to do with fear, right? So if a person has too much fear, if they're scared all the time and everything, they're terrified of every time there's a knock at the door, well, that's cowardice. On the other hand, a person can have too little fear. I mean, Aristotle thinks it's not really, you're not courageous if you don't have like any fear whatsoever. That's just stupid, he would say. Like, that's just ridiculous. So that is what Aristotle says. The general word for what you call that is foolhardy, right? A person who has too little fear is foolhardy. So it's like this scale of fear where you can have too much, you can have too little, and then the right amount is somewhere in between. And it could be different for different people, right? So it depends on your situation. Are you, are you in a dangerous situation, right? Are you walking down a dark alley at night? On the other hand, are you someone very capable of handling yourself, or not? Those can all play into, how much fear would be the right amount of fear for you to have. And there would be a range. And this is where he says, it's determined by reference to reason. So a practical person can determine it, he would say. He's not going to give you like an exact rule about this, like here's the amount of fear that everyone should have. There's a certain amount that is rational depending on your circumstances. And so if you fall in that range, if that's where you're at in your inner state, you have that much fear, then that's the right amount, and so you're courageous. And he's making a claim that that's the way it works for everything that you would normally consider a virtue. So name a virtue. He's going to go through those virtues that were considered like the main virtues in ancient Greece, but I think the idea is we could apply this to other virtues as well. He brings up temperance, which has it's built into the notion of temperance. I think that it's an appropriate amount of something, not eating too much, right? Not drinking too much. Being, in fact, in the 1930s in America, there was a temperance movement which went a little further than just like not drinking too much. They wanted to ban alcohol completely, but generally the word temperance refers to like it refers to moderation in your mostly in your eating habits and other kinds of indulgences too. So what's the thing that you have too much or too little of in connection with temperance? He seems to think it's something like indulgence, right? How much you tend to indulge in things, and if you're too indulgent, if you overindulge, right, then you're intemperate. And then people who don't indulge enough. He says in this case, it's really uncommon. And so we don't even really have a word for it, right? There's no normal word for it. But he kind of says we could call it, and they translate it as insensible. You're kind of an insensible person if you don't, a person who has no interest in enjoying food at all, no interest in any sort of indulgences. They just sort of live their life like almost like they're just a robot or something, just going about their daily duties, you know. So that's for Aristotle. That's too little indulgence. You don't have any tendency towards indulgence at all. Okay, generosity is another one that Aristotle, it seems almost kind of challenging to fit generosity into this picture, but so maybe Aristotle's kind of treating this as a challenge case, but it's possible for there's going too far with regards to generosity. If a person like gives away like all their money to their friends and like buys things for everyone in their life, like so much that they make themselves poor and they end up being of no use to anyone, then they've gone too far with this, and they've become like wasteful, or you might say profligate is another word here. And on the other hand, obviously the more obvious one is that's uncommon for people to be so generous that they're profligate, that they're wasteful. But it's more common for a person to be sort of miserly, like not generous at all, don't want to share anything with anyone. And so what is this too much of or too little of? It's not generosity, by the way. Here's something that is kind of a confusion that you're likely to fall into in thinking about this. Generosity is the name for the right amount, according to Aristotle, his way of thinking of it. And so if we say sometimes a person is too generous, that's a bit of a misnomer. It's not that the person's too generous, because you can't be too generous, because generous means you're in this appropriate range. It's that it's something else that the person does too much of. Like it's a tendency towards giving, right? So if a person has an extreme tendency towards giving, they're wasteful. If they have like no tendency towards giving, then they're miserly. And then the right amount is being generous. So sometimes we say like, oh, that person's too generous, or they're too courageous, or too temperate. But Aristotle thinks that really, if we want to be more precise with our language, it's not that they're too generous, it's that they're too giving, and that's not even generosity. It's going beyond generosity out to like wastefulness. So now, reflecting on the whole picture here, there's something interesting about this, and it's that Aristotle's describing having a certain internal state which lies at this mean as virtuous, and so that's evaluative. He's saying that's good, and so and the others are negatives. They're bad, of course. And if you notice the things that he's talking about having too much or too little of, well, they're emotions. Well, many of them are. Some of them could be described as emotions in a way, or tendencies towards something. So this is a point on which Aristotle's philosophies maybe wouldn't fit in so well with some of our modern sort of ideas, because he does think in terms of evaluating people based on sort of having these emotional tendencies, which is something, I don't know, so today maybe we would shrink back from saying that was bad that person had that emotion, right? Or it was good that this other person had this different emotional state. On the other hand, how are you supposed to get around the fact that, like, if you want a person to be, if it's good to have courageous people, and you need courageous people like for the army and so on, then how can you get around the fact that like it's having a certain amount of fear? If you have this person who's not willing to go into battle because they're too scared, like that's a negative thing. And I mean, if that means we're blaming them for like how much fear they have, well, I mean, how can you get around that? Because what else could courage involve, really? Just in defense of what Aristotle's saying here. So it's an idea that maybe wouldn't be so politically correct today, right? That that you evaluate people in terms of their emotional state. But it's also interesting that Aristotle is drawing this connection between emotion and rationality, right? That there's a certain amount of emotion that constitutes a rational amount of emotion. So this is what I was saying earlier about rationality not being confined to like the philosopher's life. It's not just that like when he concluded Virtues about rationality, it's not just that, it's sitting around thinking about stuff all the time. It's this connection that there's a rational way to behave in a certain situation, and there's a rational like amount of these different emotions to have. Another point of qualification that Aristotle makes about the whole system: for every virtue, right, there is a mean between two extremes, and what you can describe a sort of quality of character in terms of which that virtue is defined, right? So courage is defined in terms of a moderate amount of fear, or appropriate amount of fear. Temperance is in terms of a right amount of indulgence. But that doesn't mean that every quality, every character trait, a moderate amount of it will be a virtue. So, and this is something that we talk about in logic class. We do have a tendency to sometimes confuse every A has a B with every B has an A, right? And so Aristotle is saying every virtue is a mean between two extremes. That doesn't mean that every mean between extremes is a virtue. And he gives some examples where there is no like appropriate amount of like, say, cruelty, right? He's not saying like, oh, anything you pick, you can find a middle ground and that'll be the right amount of that thing. Like cruelty isn't something that there's like some appropriate amount of. And it seems like the reason is because it's already and some kind of extreme or vice. That each virtue has a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. But of course, cruelty is already a name for a vice. So that is an extreme amount of something, right? That's having too much. That's having too much of something, right? Already. So it doesn't make sense to say a right amount of cruelty, because that would be like saying a right amount of too much something, right? So cruelty, adultery, all these things that are already negative. They're already negative terms. And so it's not like he's saying there's a right amount of all these. So in any case, the doctrine of the mean idea is probably the central concept in Aristotle's ethics. And this is where he's tying together these various ideas that I suggested that I said at the beginning he was going to try to tie together. So we got the connection between happiness, function, rationality, virtue. Also, good, the concept of good, you could that he's tying that in, and obviously in moderation. So these terms are all kind of have all these connections among them for Aristotle that he's sort of tying together. Now the last few paragraphs of Book 2 are devoted to virtues of thought, or virtues, intellectual virtues. And there he says that the goal of intellectual virtues is understanding, and then wisdom is the virtue that corresponds to understanding. He makes the case that it's the best virtue in some ways, that it has some of the characteristics that we described, that we associated with like happiness earlier, that it's self-sufficient, that it's wanted for its own sake, and that it is itself pleasant. And he actually claims that this is what it means to say the gods are virtuous. People would say the gods are virtuous, the ancient Greek gods. Aristotle actually didn't agree with the way the gods were anthropomorphized in ancient Greece and thought of as having like these lives that are like just like human lives, but they're like superheroes or something. Like he thought of them as being sort of somehow more abstract than that. He thought it was kind of silly to imagine them paying debts to each other and having contracts, honoring contracts with each other. So instead he thought, well, it must be about wisdom that they have virtue. And he connects this up with the point that we don't call animals happy, according to Aristotle. It's not because they're not capable of because they don't have the intellectual capacity for like true happiness, what he considers true happiness. And it's kind of interesting to think about, like, is he aware? Did he surely must have noticed that like animals can like express emotions of sorts. Like, I mean, everybody can tell that dogs like they express sadness. They seem happy at different times. I guess he's got a specific conception of happiness here, where it's not like happiness in the moment, as we said earlier. It's kind of like contentment overall. And maybe we can kind of make sense of his statement that, we don't describe animals as happy in these terms. He also said the same thing about children, right? We don't animals and children aren't, they don't experience, they're not happy in the same way that we can talk about adults being happy. Now, whether that ultimately makes sense or not, is debatable, but that seems to be the idea. He spends some time considering like amusement and pleasure, and whether that would be just as good as these other kinds of virtues he's talking about. And he predictably kind of argues against it. First, he says that it's kind of just it's kind of a silly person who focuses their life on amusement all the time. That's not the people who we sort of esteem the most don't seem to be focused on amusing themselves all the time. So that can't be equal to like these other virtues that we're talking about. And then he also points out like happiness in his sense is something you strive for. You actually work at having this kind of overall life contentment happiness, sort of happiness. And it doesn't make sense that you strive for amusement. If you want to be amused, it's not something you don't work hard at being amused. Well, I don't know, maybe you could. But he doesn't seem to think so. So that's how he kind of closes out book 2 on this some final thoughts on intellectual virtues. The discussion of moral virtues has been the part that has more influence and has been of more interest to philosophers throughout history than this discussion on intellectual virtues. So now let's talk about a few criticisms of Aristotle's theory, a few problems. One is that, again, unlike utilitarianism and unlike Kant's ethics even, it does not provide a decision procedure, right? I mean, suppose you want to know what to do, like in a specific situation. Utilitarianism is an example where that gives you a pretty concrete framework to work in, and you sort of, weigh up how much pleasure is this likely to cause, how much pain is this likely to cause, and that's a pretty concrete kind of a system, right, that you could actually put into application. But imagine trying to like refer to Aristotle's ethics in making a decision, like I mean the decision about, like, say, distributing a vaccine or not, or which you can think very clearly in a utilitarian way about that. But what about an Aristotelian way? I mean, imagine asking Aristotle, like, okay, should I distribute this vaccine to people or not? It has these side effects and so on. And like the advice he seems to give is like, well, be generous. Okay, but like specifically, what should I do? Be generous. I'm not even sure what virtues would apply here, but I guess generosity, maybe caring for others, maybe having concern for others. Maybe there's some virtue associated with that. Be concerned for others. Well, okay, like that doesn't tell me like something to do though. So there's really no like decision procedure here. So there's one objection is in terms of this not having a decision procedure, just telling you, be a certain way, have this virtue. Now there is sort of an advantage to not providing a clear decision procedure, and that's that you're not likely to encounter counterexamples to Aristotle's theory, unlike Kant's and the utilitarian theory, where they provide this clear procedure, and then you can come up with a case where it produces something that seems obviously wrong. You'd be hard pressed to do that with Aristotle's theory, so it makes it kind of more difficult to literally disprove. But on the other hand, it's the reason it's so difficult to disprove is because it's because of a kind of unclarity in the theory. It doesn't commit to like asserting an actual observable sort of consequence that you can test. This is something that many would regard as kind of a hallmark of a theory that's unscientific. Not that theories in ethics are necessarily going to be scientific, but It is a virtue of scientific theories that they make a prediction that is about something observable, something concrete. So the fact that they could be disproven actually is a virtue of a theory. And Aristotle's theory doesn't have that. Another criticism I'd like to bring up has more to do with the details of the theory. According to the doctrine of the mean, having the right amount of each of these kind of like tendencies is the virtue, and then having excesses or deficiencies are the vices. So take, for example, courage. In Aristotle's view, courage is just the person just has this appropriate reaction for whatever reason, like they've conditioned themselves or they've been trained by their parents or by others. They just have this certain amount of fear. And since they're in the appropriate like fear range, that enables them to behave like bravely. And that raises a kind of question. What if a person has like a lot of fear? What if a person has more fear, but they overcome that fear? Like, let's say you have like two soldiers entering into a battle, and one of them has that exact amount of fear that you're supposed to have to be courageous. So that's the courageous soldier according to Aristotle. And then the other soldier has a lot more fear. So they're really scared to go into this battle, but then they overcome that fear. So then they go and they do like their duty anyway. It might be, maybe intuitively, we might want to regard that as in a way more courageous, it's more brave to overcome this fear that you have. But what Aristotle has to say about this kind of case, he says that the person who they don't have the appropriate range of fear, but they go and they do their duty anyway. They're not brave yet, according to Aristotle. They're kind of like they're imitating bravery. They're imitating what the brave person does in order to kind of develop that state that is courage within themselves, but they don't have it yet. And I guess one thing he could say in his defense here is that, again, in order for it to be the virtue of bravery, it has to be a stable tendency. So it can't be just that, today this soldier's gonna act brave because they're imitating, the soldiers who actually are brave. They have to have, in order to actually have the virtue, and it has to be that you kind of always act this way. So maybe he could say something like that. But in any case, on Aristotle's theory, being brave isn't necessarily something that's directly observable, right? You could have one person who's brave. You could have one soldier who's brave, and they're going into this battle, and another one they have this fear, and so they're not really as courageous, but they're trying to get there. They're like conditioning themselves, so they're not quite there yet. We could have some debate about whether to consider that a weakness, an objection to the theory, or whether it really makes sense. Now I'll bring up one more objection, and it's the objection that we directly saw Kant make to such theories that base morality on these character traits. And Kant says that any character trait could be used for evil as well as good, and he specifically says courage, and maybe that's because that was featured heavily in Aristotle's theory so many years before, that was so influential. And Kant says you could have a courageous person who uses their courage to go and rob you or something. I mean, that's another problem that maybe you could work out from an Aristotelian point of view. You could say something like, that the courage of the bank robber is mixed in with other negative traits, so that the negative outweighs the positive, or something along those lines. But then, of course, the Kantian criticism would be like, isn't the courage itself something negative in this case? So in any case, we've got the essential points of the theory down, I think, and a few criticisms, a few objections. So hopefully you find this helpful and maybe gives you something to think about in terms of Aristotle's ethics.